Hello, Dobry den. Thank you for joining us. My name is Borys Sydoruk. I am the chair of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress National Internment Centenary Committee and chair of the Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Foundation. Today, we have gathered together virtually to mark the end of a dark chapter in our shared history. I am standing in front of the Castle Mountain Internment Camp statue and plaque in Banff National Park. I was born and raised in Calgary, grew up seeing the mountains, and have come here many times in my life. Until 1989, I had no idea, nor do most Canadians to this day, of what happened to the thousands of Ukrainians and other Europeans who were branded as enemy aliens during the First World War. During Canada's first national internment operations of 1914 to 1920, 8,579 men, and some women and children, were interned by the Canadian government acting under the authority of the War Measures Act. While most were recent immigrants from the multinational Austro-Hungarian, German, and Ottoman empires, some were Canadian-born or naturalized British subjects. Most of the civilian internees came from the western regions of Halachina, the German Austrian term is Galicia, and of course Bukovina. Held in 24 receiving stations and internment camps across the country, from Nanaimo, British Columbia to Halifax, Nova Scotia, these second-class prisoners of war, POWs, were generally separated from the first-class Germans and Austrian POWs. Many were transported to the country's frontier wilderness and obliged to work for the profit of their jailers. Personal wealth and property were confiscated, not all of which was returned on parole or following the end of the internment operations in 1920. Canada's first national internment operations were shaped by the pre-war prejudices that were exacerbated by wartime xenophobia. Between 1891 and the outbreak of the First World War, some 170,000 Ukrainian immigrants arrived from Canada, lured to the Dominion with promises of freedom and free land. Only a few years later, after these pioneer settlers arrived in the Northwest Territories, a clergyman, Father Morris, expressed his loathing for them in the Calgary's Daily Herald. On January 27, 1899, he wrote, "As for the Galicians, I have not met a single person in the whole of the Northwest who is sympathetic to them. They are, from the point of civilization, 10 times lower than the Indians. They have not the least idea of sanitation. In their personal habits and acts, they resemble animals, and even in the streets of Edmonton, when they come to market, men, women, and children would, if unchecked, turn the place into a common sewer." Such bigotry persisted in the immediate post-World War period. An inflammatory editorial in the February 10, 1919 Winnipeg Telegram demanding enemy aliens must go questioned whether it was necessary to import a race of inferior beings to do our work, or right for returning soldiers to compete with the bohunks of Central Europe, who have been accustomed in their own country to submit to being driven like cattle, who are ignorant of every principle of sanitation and lost to all sense of decency in living conditions. The writer insisted that returned soldiers or any other white man must be given decent working conditions, and if those conditions in any occupation at present are unfit for a white man, then they must be made fit. It will then be unnecessary to depend upon enemy aliens for labor to develop the resources of Canada. Evidently, the Ukrainians, Croatians, Serbians, Hungarians, and other East Europeans herded into Canadian concentration camps were not as white as some label them today. Instead, they were racialized as others. Internees were exploited for their labor in the national parks of Western Canada, building roads, clearing bush, cutting trails, and even building a portion of the golf course in Banff. Others helped carve experimental farms out of the boreal wilderness at Kapuskasing in northern Ontario and Spirit Lake in the Abitibi region of northern Quebec. Conditions were trying. The guards were sometimes brutal. and so resentment at what may be regarded as their unjust confinement was widespread, provoking resistance, some passive, such as work slowdowns. Other efforts were more determined, including escape attempts, and even a massive riot involving some 1,200 internees at Kapuskasing in May of 1916 that required the intervention of some 300 armed soldiers before it was put down. In total, 107 internees died in captivity. 6 were shot dead while trying to escape. Others succumbed to infectious diseases, work-related injuries, and suicide. In many cases, they were buried in unmarked graves or cemeteries far from their communities and loved ones, their final resting place all but forgotten. Decades later, a former Kapuskasing prisoner returned to pay his respects at the internee cemetery, recalling, "Here, the men who cleared the forests lay forgotten by the world as if they were made by another god. But I had not forgotten them. As I walked back into town, I remember what we promised each other in the camp. We were going to tell the world how we were tortured, and it would become part of history." Despite the end of fighting on the Western Front following the signing of the armistice on November 11, 1918, the Internment Operations Branch, commanded by Sir William Dillon Otter, remained active until June 20, 1920. Efforts to secure acknowledgement and redress for Canada's first national internment operations began in 1978 after Nick Sekuliuk provided testimony to Lubomir Lutsyuk about his experiences as an internee at Fort Henry in Kingston, Ontario, and then in Petawawa and Kapuskasing camps, telling a story the Ukrainian Canadian community had all but forgotten. Yet almost a decade would pass before a concerted campaign to right this historic injustice began, spearheaded by the Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Association under the chairmanship of John B. Grigorovich. During the First World War, thousands of Ukrainians and other Europeans found themselves targeted for internment and other repressive measures, not because of any wrong they had done, but only where they had come from, who they were. The crippling legacy of what happened to them would endure and be detected decades later by an RCMP informant who, in August of 1941, told his superiors how some Ukrainian Canadians were still in fear of the barbed wire fence, reflecting on how the civil liberties of so many Canadians were revoked on 2 subsequent occasions, during the Second World War and the 1970 October Crisis. A child survivor of the Spirit Lake internment camp in northern Quebec, Mrs. Mary Manco Haskett, reflected, and she says, "What was done to us was wrong, because no one bothered to remember or learn about the wrong that was done to us. It was done to others again and yet again. Maybe there's even a greater wrong in that." So today we gather here to do just that, to remember. Vichnayim Pamyat. Let us never forget.